Your brain was not built to want children constantly. It was built to want sex constantly. Those are two very different instructions, and the gap between them has been quietly shaping human behavior for longer than history itself. Here's a strange fact about your species. Almost no other mammal on Earth lives for decades after it stops being able to reproduce. A female chimpanzee, your closest living relative, is fertile for nearly her entire adult life and then dies not long after. But human women, across every population ever studied, often live 30 or 40 years past menopause. Evolutionary biologists have a name for this puzzle. They call it the grandmother hypothesis. The theory goes like this. A woman who survives past her own fertility and helps raise her grandchildren increases the odds that those grandchildren survive too. Her genes get passed on, just through a side door. Natural selection, in other words, has spent hundreds of thousands of years quietly rewarding humans who could separate reproduction from survival, who could help a family thrive without personally adding another mouth to feed. Sit with that for a second. Your evolutionary history already contains a template for decoupling sex, or at least parenting, from constant reproduction. So maybe it should not surprise you that ancient people took that same logic and applied it earlier in the timeline. If nature could uncouple usefulness from fertility at the end of a woman's life, why would humans not try to uncouple pleasure from fertility everywhere else? They tried, and they left a paper trail. The oldest known instructions come from Egypt, written on papyrus around 1825 BCE, nearly 4,000 years before the birth control pill. The document is called the Kahun Papyrus, and it reads less like mysticism and more like a recipe card. One instruction calls for crocodile dung mixed into fermented dough, shaped into a plug, and inserted before sex. Say that out loud and it sounds like a joke. But look at the chemistry. Crocodile dung is alkaline. Sperm need a slightly acidic environment to survive, and an alkaline barrier is actively hostile to them. The fermentation would have pushed that acidity further off balance. It was not magic. It was applied, if crude, biochemistry, built from whatever raw materials a Nile-adjacent civilization happened to have, lying around in abundance. A second Egyptian recipe swaps the dung for honey mixed with natron, the same mineral salt Egyptians used to preserve mummies. Honey has documented antimicrobial and mildly spermicidal properties. Natron is aggressively alkaline. Neither ingredient stopped pregnancy reliably, but neither one was doing nothing either. Somebody, 4,000 years ago, was running informal trials on their own body, noticing patterns, and passing the results forward. That is not superstition. That is the earliest recorded form of applied reproductive science, built by people with no microscopes, no hormonal theory, and no concept of sperm at all. The plant world is where this story gets bigger, stranger, and considerably more tragic. Across nearly every inhabited continent, researchers studying traditional medicine have documented cultures with detailed, specific knowledge of plants that interfere with fertility. These cultures had no contact with one another, no shared trade routes, no shared texts, sometimes not even a shared hemisphere. And yet the same category of solution kept appearing, independently invented, over and over. That is not a coincidence. Plants produce chemical compounds to defend themselves against insects and fungus, not to help or hurt human reproduction. But some of those defensive compounds happen to interact with mammalian hormones anyway, as a kind of biochemical side effect. Humans, through generations of trial, error, and careful observation, found the plants where that side effect actually worked in their favor. Take wild carrot, sometimes called Queen Anne's lace. Hippocrates wrote about its seeds as a contraceptive in the 5th century BCE, and traditional healers in parts of South Asia were still using it that way well into the modern era. Laboratory studies have since confirmed that wild carrot seeds contain compounds that interfere with progesterone production and block implantation. It is not safe and it is not reliable. The effective dose sits uncomfortably close to the toxic one, but it is not inert either. Something measurable happens inside the body when it is used correctly, which puts it ahead of a great deal of what passed for ancient medicine. Then there is silphium, which might be the single strangest object in this entire history, because it is the story of a plant that got loved to death. Silphium grew in one narrow strip of land near the Greek colony of Cyrene, on the coast of what is now Libya and nowhere else on Earth. Ancient writers described it constantly. Hippocrates, Pliny the Elder, Dioscorides, all documenting its contraceptive and abortion-inducing effects with a level of specific, repeated detail that suggests real observed results rather than folklore. Demand for it became so intense that it turned into the economic backbone of an entire city. It appears stamped onto Cyrene's coins. Ancient sources describe it as worth more than its weight in silver, in some accounts worth more than gold. And because it could not be cultivated outside its one wild strip of coastline, the harvesting eventually outran the plant's ability to regrow. By the 1st century CE, it was gone. Extinct. The last known stalk, according to Roman writers, was sent to the Emperor Nero as a curiosity rather than a medicine. Humanity wanted a plant so badly for its power over reproduction that it erased the plant from existence and took the exact chemical formula with it. We will never know precisely what was inside silphium because there is no more silphium left to study. The Greeks had other tools too, and one of the cleverer ones came straight out of the sea. Aristotle recorded that women soaked natural sea sponges in vinegar or wine and inserted them before intercourse. This was not one trick, it was two stacked together. The sponge itself worked as a physical barrier, while the acidic liquid it was soaked in created a hostile, sperm-killing environment. The same basic chemical principle behind the Egyptian recipes, just executed with completely different raw materials. Different coastline, different ingredients, same underlying insight rediscovered independently. That is really the pattern worth noticing here. Egypt, Greece, and dozens of cultures never in contact with either one kept landing on the same handful of chemical strategies: acidity, barriers, plant compounds that disrupt hormones. Not because anyone shared the recipe, but because the human body only offers a limited number of doors, and enough determined, observant people eventually find most of them. If plants were chemistry, the next set of solutions was pure engineering. Humans looked at a mechanical problem and built mechanical answers, and they did it in more places, with more materials than you would expect. Egyptians appear to have used thin linen sheaths worn during intercourse, likely serving double duty against both pregnancy and disease. In ancient Japan, similar coverings were crafted from tortoise shell and later from animal intestine, which was exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds and probably explains why barrier methods were used far less than their actual effectiveness deserved. Romans took a different animal-based approach entirely, using goat bladder for the same purpose. 3 unrelated cultures, 3 different raw materials, 1 shared engineering solution. Put a physical barrier between sperm and its destination. That same barrier logic shows up again more than 1,000 years later, in 18th century Europe, in one of the more inventive improvisations in this entire history. The famous Venetian Giacomo Casanova wrote of using half a hollowed-out lemon rind as a makeshift cervical cap, fitted over the cervix before sex. It sounds absurd until you check the chemistry, and then it sounds almost familiar. Citrus juice is naturally acidic, hostile to sperm, for the same reason the crocodile dung recipe worked through alkalinity, just approaching the same biological weakness from the opposite chemical direction. A rind shaped by hand, from fruit sitting in a Venetian kitchen, solving a problem that Egyptian priests had already solved with dung and dough 3,500 years earlier. Different eras, different continents, same target. Withdrawal needs almost no historical citation because it appears everywhere. It shows up in the Hebrew Bible, in the story of Onan, from which one of its older names is derived. Ancient medical writers described it as an unremarkable common practice. Modern research estimates it reduces pregnancy risk by roughly 78% with careful use, a number that quietly tells you just how inconsistently it tends to be used in the real world. It required no plan, no preparation, no cost, no trade route to a Libyan coastline. Just behavior, which likely made it, across the full sweep of human history, the single most commonly used method of them all. But if you are looking for the method that probably prevented more pregnancies than every plant, sponge, and lemon rind combined, it is one many people would not think to call a method at all. Extended breastfeeding suppresses the hormonal signals that trigger ovulation. In traditional societies where nursing routinely continued for 2 or 3 years, this created substantial natural spacing between births, often without anyone consciously trying to manage anything. Anthropologists studying contemporary traditional communities have found that some women describe this effect explicitly, choosing to nurse longer specifically because they know it delays the next pregnancy. Whether that understanding stretches back into deep prehistory is impossible to prove. But the biological effect itself is exactly as old as human breastfeeding, which means it is close to being as old as humanity. Not every ancient method was quite this grounded. Timing-based approaches, essentially forerunners of the rhythm method, existed too, but they were often built on completely wrong information. Hippocrates believed conception was most likely to occur immediately after menstruation. Modern reproductive biology places actual ovulation roughly 2 weeks later, near the middle of the cycle. That means anyone practicing cycle-based abstinence based on Hippocratic guidance for the next 2,000 years was very possibly avoiding sex at precisely the wrong moment, while feeling confidently protected the rest of the time. The real timing of ovulation was not correctly worked out until the 20th century. Confidence in this particular corner of ancient medicine was badly out of step with accuracy. Not everyone was working from guesswork, though. The Greek physician Cyrene of Ephesus, practicing in Rome during the 2nd century CE, wrote a gynecological text with a level of clinical precision that would not feel out of place in a modern medical journal. He carefully separated contraceptives, which prevent conception, from abortifacients, which end an existing pregnancy, and he explicitly argued that prevention was the safer, more responsible choice of the two. He organized his recommended methods by a rough hierarchy of reliability, weighing effectiveness against risk in a way that reflects real clinical reasoning rather than blind faith in tradition. Some of what he recommended holds up remarkably well. Olive oil and cedar resin, both of which he suggested applying to wool pessaries, have documented spermicidal effects confirmed by modern researchers. Other recommendations did not age nearly as gracefully. White lead was genuinely effective at killing sperm, and it was also slowly poisoning the woman using it, a trade-off Cyrene apparently considered acceptable under the medical standards of his era. So who actually held all of this knowledge? That question matters more than it might first seem, because the answer reveals something the historical record tends to obscure. Reproductive control was never evenly distributed as a concern. It mattered more to some people than others, and the reasons were rarely just personal preference. In ancient Rome, enslaved women faced perhaps the most urgent version of this need. Pregnancy meant a child born into slavery, and the constant threat of sexual violence made unwanted pregnancy a persistent danger rather than a hypothetical one. Free Roman women carried different pressures. Marriage functioned partly as economic and political strategy, where producing legitimate heirs was a firm social expectation. But too many children could strain a household's resources, and pregnancy resulting from certain relationships could trigger serious legal consequences under Roman law. And across many ancient cultures, women working in the sex trade, the heterae of Greece, workers in Rome's legally regulated brothels, had the most consistent, most immediate motivation of all to seek out methods that actually worked. Some researchers studying this history argue that these women, driven by direct necessity, may have preserved and passed along more practical contraceptive knowledge than the formal medical texts ever did. And that points to the real gap in the historical record. Cyrene wrote his knowledge down so it survived in a library. The grandmother who quietly told her granddaughter which root to boil into tea and exactly when to drink it did not write anything down at all. That knowledge lived in conversation, passed hand to hand between women in the same household or the same village, and it left almost no trace for archaeologists or historians to find. Which means the version of this story visible in ancient texts, written almost entirely by men, is very likely a small, formal fraction of a much larger, mostly invisible body of practical knowledge that was actually being used. What emerges from all of it is a strikingly consistent picture. On every inhabited continent, in every era for which any evidence survives, people were trying seriously and persistently to separate sex from pregnancy. They used whatever their environment gave them. Chemistry when they understood chemistry. Mechanics when they understood mechanics. Careful, patient observation when they had nothing else. Some of it worked. Silphium worked so well that an entire species was consumed into extinction by demand for it. Some of it, like Hippocratic cycle timing, did not work at all, while offering false confidence to anyone who trusted it. But none of it was random. It was humanity running an informal multi-thousand-year experiment on its own bodies, refining the results across generations, long before anyone had a word for hormones and long before anyone could explain why any of it worked the way that it did. The desire behind all of it was never a modern invention. It was not created by the 20th century or the sexual revolution or a small pill developed in a laboratory. It was there in the crocodile dung recipes of ancient Egypt. It was there in the silphium fields of North Africa, harvested until nothing remained. It was there in a Venetian lemon rind, and in a Roman goat bladder, and in the quiet knowledge passed between women who never once wrote any of it down. The desire to have sex without having children is, by every piece of evidence available, exactly as old as the desire to have sex itself, which, it turns out, is about as old as anything gets.